Hey, it's Jay, and welcome back to Tears of the Kingdom. I have a bit of a different idea for what I want to do for this episode. And I'll explain it while we're on the way trying to find these guys. But I mentioned back when I first learned that you could ride the dragons, which I think was like 30 fucking streams ago. Like 30 fucking streams ago or something like that. I mentioned that, oh god, I got the burps, what the hell? That I heard that you could actually ride the dragons around the entire map. And I thought that was super cool, and they meant that it might be cool to just ride the dragons. And so I think today, that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and find all three of the dragons, and I'm going to ride each of them and just see their whole path. Now, the thing is, that's a little bit annoying about that, is apparently each of the dragons has a, around 30-minute long path that they follow. And, I have no idea if I'm at all going to be able to fill, 30 minutes on the backs of these damn things. Okay, well, I'll see if I can see DINRAAL from down here. We're going to try and follow this path in reverse and see if we can run into DINRAAL. They have a 30-minute long path, and so this would be like an hour and a half of me just sitting on a dragon's back, which, for one thing, I don't know if I'm going to have enough commentary to fill that kind of time. I was originally considering making this a mute stream, but then I also kind of wanted to, get, my thoughts in on some of this shit. General's actually almost at the chasm. Oh, and he's going above the... Yeah, he's just about to hit the chasm. Okay, we'll get him on his way up, then. Just as he leaves. I don't know if I'm going to have enough commentary to really fill a whole hour and a half. And so originally I was thinking about making this mute stream, but then I wouldn't be able to react to, the environment of, oh, look, you can see that place from here. Oh, look, you can see that place from there. And so I think that I do kind of want to do this in an in-person stream, especially because it's early in the morning and it'll help me, warm up and, wake up a little bit. But the other thing is, I know that this is going to, really eat up a lot of space on my hero's journey, a whole hour and a half worth of hero's journey just on riding on the dragons. But, it's also going to eat up a lot of my hero's journey running back and forth between the dragons. So, I don't think it's, that big of a loss in the grand scheme of things. Alright, we'll make it over to the chasm, and hopefully we can land on him as he's coming out.
You want ramen noodles and hot dogs? Okay.
Just about see him leaving now. I think we'll wait till he's flattened out more, so it'll be easy to land on. And I think the main benefit about trying this is supposedly the dragons will reset their materials around every 10 minutes, and it's around a 3-minute run for them to get through their whole loop, which means that we should get 3 dragon parts from this whole ordeal. And that's actually very nice because right now I have 1 horn from each dragon, and I'm at least pretty sure you need 4 horns from each to fully upgrade everything. Now, that said, apparently I missed whatever was used to upgrade the Fierce Deity. I didn't get that in the list somehow. Oops there. But I'm sure it'll turn out fine. Hoping I can just stand. I imagine that gripping it would also be fine for stamina, because it only really usually uses it up when you move. Let's go ahead and let's hit another general horn. Rock hammer's badly damaged, and so that's not very great, but whatever. DINRAAL actually has probably the most interesting path out of the 3 dragons, because the other 2 go, the other 3, I guess, would also include the Light Dragon, which I guess this also applies to. But Nidra and Feroche, they both have a circular path where they go in like an arch in like the surface world, and then they go in like an arch around the depths, and it just creates a full circle when you look at the whole thing. But DINRAAL is a little bit more interesting in that she goes across like the entire northern section of the map, goes underground, and then she just follows basically the same path from below, which I think is like an interesting change. It's kind of cool. I'm imagining that's because like the alternative probably would have involved her like getting too close to the entrance of the Great Hyrule Forest or going into Central Hyrule, and maybe the developers didn't like that. But she did follow most of like the Hyrule Ridge and Tabantha in the original, and so I wouldn't think that would be like that big of an issue. But whatever. The zones that she is in, though, is quite interesting. She travels through Akkala and Tabantha, which I think is pretty neat. Because Akkala, of course, has like the orangish sort of trees, and Eldin has all of the lava, or at least it used to. And so she kind of sticks to like the red zones, being the red dragon, which I just think is kind of a nice little touch. All right, and we'll just see where this takes us. Not actually as good of a shot of the world as I was expecting from up here. I guess, of course, like the fire isn't helping in this particular instance, but also the sort of cloudy effect when you're this high up in the sky does limit a little bit what you can see. But we got the spiral down there. You can see a Akkala Citadel standing tall and proud. Apparently, and like looking at it now, yeah, I guess. Apparently, Death Mountain is actually the highest point in the map on Breath of the Wild. And I guess, not counting Sky Island, so it would probably still be the same here. And it's like, I never really clocked that. I always assumed that Lanayru and Hebra were, like, tied for the tallest mountain. But no, like, Death Mountain might actually be bigger. It also might just be, like, a very, very similar height, and it's just barely tall enough. You get the sort of old lab coming up here. It's been completely demolished, which I just think is, like, a little bit sad, honestly. Such an iconic location. Throbbey. Is the Citadel, or the Labyrinth, was the Labyrinth always that low down? It must have been. Because I think it was on the ground, and the walls weren't that high. I just thought that it was more on par with the cliff face. I'm probably just misremembering that massively, though. I do that a lot. But anyway, the first thing that I kind of wanted to talk about, I've just been kind of like pushing around some ideas for like little like rants and tangents that I can go on. Stuff that like I've been debating, like if I should make it like a video at some point, but I'm not very good at editing, and so I've never really tried that. First thing I kind of want to talk about is I guess Bionicle. I love Bionicle, and so I'm going to ramble about Bionicle for a freaking massive amount of time. I'll try and keep it mostly spoiler free. But the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about was the elements in Bionicle, because this is like a conversation that I just had in the back of my head. If anybody asks me, hey, how many elements are there in Bionicle? It's a little bit difficult to explain. And so I've got this whole like little like tangent and rant that I go on. And the long and the short of it is that in the main location of Bionicle, the Matoran universe, there are 6 primary elements, 8 secondary elements, 2 tertiary elements, and then 2 technical elements that like don't really count, but you could theoretically count. On the world of Spherus Magna, there are 8 elements, and on the world of Akoto in Generation 2, there are 8 elements. So, the primary elements in Gen 1 Matoran Universe of Bionicle are fire, water, air, earth, stone, and ice. We like to call them the primary elements because they're just kind of like the 6 Bionicle elements that have like always been there and are super prevalent. We know that they exist in Matoran, and whenever I say Matoran, I also mean Toa and Turaga. They exist in Matoran, they exist in Skakti, they exist in the Gafna, and there's lots of other Rahi that have those sort of elemental powers. And perhaps, like, most importantly to our story, we meet, like, 4 full teams of Toa that exclusively consist of members of those elements. And every single wave of Matoran sets that they put out were confined to those 6 elements, with the exception of the 2008 Matoran, which even then, their color schemes paralleled those Matoran elements. And so that's just kind of, they're just kind of very prevalent and present within the franchise. There's also all elemental masks for all of them, but that's like a bit of like a side tangent kind of thing. The 8 secondary elements are a little bit more complicated in Bionicle. I always forget at least one when I'm trying to list them. But if I remember right, it's lightning, psionics, sonics, iron, magnetism, gravity, plant life, and plasma. Um, and the thing with these secondary elements is that they're a lot more minor to the main plot. We know for a fact that there are Matoran of all of these elements and elemental masks for all of these elements, and it has been hinted, although not flat out confirmed, that there are Skakti for all of these elements. Whether or not there are Gaften, though, it's never been specified, and I'm assuming not, because we probably, I mean, we probably wouldn't have, but like, it would be weird if there were Gafna of those elements. And the secondary elements, they're just a lot less prevalent and relevant to the franchise as a whole. I think that the first one that we saw was Toa Krakua, Toa of Sonics in 2005. I think it was the first introduction of a secondary element. And from then on, most of the secondary elements, like main presence in the franchise, is one, maybe two Toa that have that element. And sometimes it's not even that. For like plant life, for example, the only plant life characters been identified in the franchise is an unnamed Toa that Hakon knocks unconscious during Legacy of Evil, and an unnamed Toa who is a part of the Toa Man guy. And it's like, okay, two unnamed Toa plant life that don't actually like do anything in the story is like the entire prevalence of plant life in the franchise, for example. And so the secondary elements just kind of like fall a little bit more by the wayside. They aren't nearly as important to anything, really. But they are there. They are there. Oh, we're actually near the Sky Archipelago. That's kind of cool. Oh, wait, is that the one where you fight the Flux Construct? I think that it is. Yeah, that's the place where you fight that one Flux Construct, right? Yeah. That's kind of cool. You can see the sort of Skull Lake down there, which is very nice. Actually, thinking about it now, gliding over to that Flux Construct Island and then diving down would have been a very effective way to get into the eye of the Skull Lake and actually explode the whole Skull Lake. Shame I didn't do that. I imagine that with like the gliding and like building like the freaking platform with like the rocket shit and whatnot, it would be a similar amount of time to get there. Definitely more on the hero's journey, but whatever. So anyway, secondary elements in Bionicle. And so yeah, they're just all kind of there. A little bit less important. Then you get to the tertiary elements. And there's two tertiary elements, light and shadow. And there where the discussion gets a little bit more complicated. We know for a fact that there are absolutely no Skakti of light, and it's pretty well presumed that there would be no Gafna of light. However, there are Matoran of light, and we have seen one Toa of light, who we know can become a Turaga of light. So it is a Matoran element, which by all accounts does make it an element in the Bionicle universe. But the thing about Matoran of light is they only like naturally natively live. They're like homeland. The only place where they're actually found is in Cardanui, which is a land that's a bit more concealed and hidden off from the rest of the Matoran universe. It's very hard to get into or get out of. And so not many people have met Matoran of light. Matoran of light also function biologically a little bit different than your standard Matoran, in that they have actual elemental powers. For most Matoran, their element is just meant to reflect like the color of their armor and the environment where they live. They do have minor elemental things, but they're more elemental resistances than they are elemental powers. For example, Matoran of fire tend to work in furnaces and around forges and shit like that, so they're heat resistant. Matoran of water tend to work in dockyards and shipyards, so they have a higher lung capacity and are stronger swimmers. You know, they're all just kind of like environmental helps for these Matoran. But for Matoran of light, they actually do have elemental light powers. They can create light, they can shoot light beams and lasers, and all sorts of shit like that. So they're more powerful than your typical Matoran. But still, definitely counts as a Matoran power. It is one of the elements. Shadow is where things get interesting. Where the main, like, sort of elemental characters in Bionicle are the Makuta. The Makuta have the element of shadow, and they're quite, like, upfront about that. However, there's a sort of plot arc in 2008 that involves the Shadow Matoran, where the basic gist of it is that, the basic gist of it is that if you expose a Matoran to this little parasitic creature called a Shadow Leech, the Shadow Leech can drain the Matoran of their moral light energy and transform them into a Matoran of Shadow. And while we don't know if this happens for other Matoran of types, if you do that to a Matoran of Light, they will actually get Shadow Elemental powers. These Shadow Leeches also work for other characters in the Bionicle universe. For example, Toa. A Toa of Light would become a Toa of Shadow with Shadow powers, and the other Toa presumably would have become Toa of Shadow even if they didn't have any elemental powers from it. It's not entirely clear. So there are members of the Matoran species of Shadow, but they're all artificially created, even by cyborg standards. They're all artificially created. And so whether or not it really counts as an element is debatable, but most people do consider it to be an element, at the very least because the Makuta are such a prevalent race in the Bionicle lore. Then that brings us to the two technical elements, acid and sand. And I'll talk about acid now, but I'll save sand for a minute. So the reason why acid is sort of a technical element is because its existence in the Bionicle lore world is a little bit weird. There's the lizard lake down there. That's kind of cool. Is there anything else I can see from this side of Eldin? That's a tall ass spire. I don't really noticed that before. We're approaching Gut Check Rock down there. Where are we? Oh, we just passed Gut Check Rock. Hold on. I'm gonna take a look at Gut Check Rock from above. Oh, but I don't want to fall off the dragon. I don't think I'm gonna be able to see Gut Check Rock from above. Actually, it's a little bit too past the main of DINRAAL. But yeah, the two tertiary or the two technical elements. So for acid, the main existence of acid comes from the Borak horde. Now, the Borak were a species of creatures in Bionicle that showed up in 2002. Which, I mean, I guess I tried to say I would avoid spoilers. Minor spoilers here. I mean, I'll try and keep it vague to not give it too away. But the long and the short of it is that the Borak are the same species of Matoran. I won't explain exactly how they are. I'll let people discover that on their own. But they are very closely related to the Matoran. And throughout the series, we meet the regular-ass Borak and the elite Borak Kal. Now, for the regular-ass Borak, 5 of them have the same elements of the primary elements. There's fire, water, ice, earth, and stone Borak. For the Borak Kal, 5 of the Borak Kal have things that line up with the secondary elements. There's lightning, magnetism, gravity, plasma, and sonics. But it's with the green Borak that things get a little bit more complicated and weird. The green Borak Kal, Levic Kal, is a Borak of vacuum, which is interesting because vacuum is actually a sub-power of the element of air. It is not its own element. It is just one of the abilities that air elementals have, which is weird that he both doesn't have the full elemental set, and that's also weird that the primary element is now being grouped in with all the secondary elements. But where things get weirder is with the regular green Borak, with the Levac. The Levac have the element of acid. And it's this very weird thing in Bionicle where that's not even the only time it happens. The Kilorak, the Visorak, the green Visorak also have acidic spit, but I don't think they're ever referred to as an acid elemental. And there are other characters in the franchise that have acid swords or acid spit or acid venom, but they're also not considered acid elementals. But the Levac, who are technically a part of the Matoran race, are considered acid elementals. But to make things even weirder, there's the Leviathan, that's kind of cool. But to make things even weirder, there are the main writer of the franchise, Greg Farshi, has flat out confirmed. Well, there's actually a very interesting plateau over there. That's kind of neat looking. Where exactly is that? Oh, it's the Isle of Rabak. Oh, it looks so weird from this angle and not covered in lava. That's interesting. But Greg Farshi, the main writer of the books, has flat out confirmed that there are no Matoran, Toa, or Turaga of acid, which kind of makes sense to people. It's yeah, that's a very destructive thing to make a Matoran element out of. It would be a little bit weird if there was, but still, it was an interesting thing for him to confirm that this potential element of Bionicle lore just isn't there actually. which is a little bit odd. And actually, I'm looking at the timer now. We're only like halfway through. We're already at 20 minutes, and we haven't even hit the underground. So I'm wondering if it's like 30 minutes for this dragon to do their sky path, and then 30 minutes for the underground. That might be the case. If that's the case, maybe we'll just do DINRAAL today, and then we can do separate streams for Ferocia and Nidra later. Because I don't really want to stream for 3 hours just riding a dragon. I don't really want 3 hours on my hero's journey to be just for a dragon. But I do want to see the full loop. And it would give me all the parts that I need. I can't fill 3 hours of commentary, though. I can't. Oh, I don't know. I'll see how I'm feeling when we actually hit the underground, whether I want to stay on DINRAAL and keep talking or not, because I'm already like pretty well into like this whole discussion I was going to have. Okay, so then that brings us to the last technical element of sand. And in order to explain sand, we're going to have to jump away from the Matoran universe and instead talk about the elements of Spherus Magna. So Spherus Magna has 8 elements. There's one that people debate whether or not it should even be considered canon, but like canonically there are 8, but like technically there are 8 elements on Spherus Magna. And those 8 elements are fire, water, ice, jungle, iron, earth, rock, and sand. And it is worth noting that the elements of Spherus Magna came before the Matoran universe ones, and they were more based on like places where these tribes of people naturally lived. Like the people that lived at the base of a volcano were the fire tribe. The people that lived out in like the deserts were the sand tribe. And it was just like where they lived and the type of armor that they wore to camouflage themselves. And the type of armor they wore to camouflage themselves. Well, eventually these dudes called the Great Beings came by, and they were these like brilliant inventors that created all sorts of like complex contraptions and whatnot, and crazy experiments. And the Great Beings decided to do a little bit of modification to the tribes of Spherus Magna. And they ended up making it so that they ended up like taking a member from each of the tribes, except for Iron, which we'll get to, and they imbued them with special like magical powers in order to transform them into the elemental lords, giving them magic abilities to control whatever element had been like culturally relevant to their tribe originally. And so they were the first like proper like elemental characters in Bionicle. Fast forward even further, and the Great Beings create the Matoran universe, which we won't really get into what that is or why they created it, but long story short, they were creating the Matoran universe. And when creating the Matoran universe, they wanted to leave some of the Spherus Magna culture in the Matoran universe, as like a sort of like reflection of themselves. And so they decided to incorporate some of the elemental tribes into the Matoran that they were building. Now, fire, ice, and water all got in as primary elements, just flat out. No modifications or changes necessary. Iron was made into a secondary element, because by this point in the story, the Iron Tribe had been wiped out by the Dreaming Plague, they called it, which I won't get into. And so the Iron Tribe was entirely extinct, and so they wanted to pay tribute to the Iron Tribe and their like franchise's history, but since they weren't around anymore, they thought that like a secondary element would be worthy enough of that like honor. For Jungle, they made a slight like alteration where, for reasons that I won't get into, but I'm sure anyone who knows the lore will understand why. The Matoran universe, the air present was more important than the presence of air was considered more important than the plants that produced that air. To put it vaguely, and so the Great Beings decided that jungle would be denoted to a secondary element, and it became known as plant life or the green, depending on who you ask. And then air was promoted as a brand new primary element. Now, it's with the last 3 that things get really confusing and weird. The long and the short of it is they took the powers of the elemental lord of earth, the armor color of the rock tribe, and debatably the culture of the iron tribe, and they put them together to create the Matoran element of earth. They then took the elemental powers of the Lord of Rock, the armor colors and the environment that they live in for the Sand Tribe, and jobs that weren't really present on Spherus Magna before, to create the Matoran element of stone. And then the Earth Tribe, and then the Sand Tribe, they decided was completely irrelevant and not needed, and it was not put into the Matoran universe. So that's just one of those like really weird bits of Bionicle lore that for whatever reason, they just decided to for whatever reason, Spherus Magna had 3 redundant tribes, while the Matorn universe had 2 sort of redundant tribes. But then also, the exact makeup of those redundant tribes completely changed in between entries. Now, Greg Varshty has gone on record and said that there is no sand element in the Matorn universe at all. There are no Matorn of sand, there are no Toa of sand, but sand as an element does exist to some degree, and I might be forgetting some, but there are 2 examples I can think of sand elementals in Bionicle, and those would be the Crawley, I think they were called. No, Kahuna, I think it was. One of the robot Vaki models, one of the elite Vaki, had the ability to transmute itself into sand and back at will. And then there was also Devastator, the Dark Hunter, who had a lot of freaky powers, but he was also capable of transmuting his body into sentient sand and then just moving around like that. So there are technically 2 sand elementals that you could say in the Matorn universe. But that's where you run into the next sort of problem, issue, whatever you want to call it, is that the Vaki were completely artificial robotic creatures created around 3,000, 5,000 years ago by the Matorn. And Devastator was a freak accident, monster of nature, one-of-a-kind entity that was created was not created by the Great Beings. He just appeared in Karzani one day. So neither Devastator nor that Vaki model were made by the Great Beings, and so they did not intend for sand to be an elemental power in the Matorn universe, even if those 2 characters have it. And yeah, this is going to take a whole hour. I mean, I could make this a thing of just every day off, I start off with an hour-long stream riding the dragons. I could do that, and I could just keep riding DINRAAL all the day. That might be fun to do. I think that'll be fine, because I started this a little bit later than I intended to anyway, and I'm going to want to eat when this is done, so I think that's what we're going to do. We'll just ride DINRAAL out, and then we'll do something different when I come back. So yeah, they just kind of completely act sand as an element. And this is actually a thing that has not super sat well with Bionicle fans. Most Bionicle fans are cool with leaving acid as a weird wayside thing and not bothering making Toa or Matorn for it. But there are a lot of Bionicle mockists and fan writers and fanfic writers and whatnot that do just create a shit ton of Toa of Sand OCs, just because it's so weird not having that have a presence in the franchise. It's one of those things that feels like it really should be there, and it's just not. So now that brings us to Generation 2 and its elements, which is remarkably more simple than either of the Gen 1 elemental tiers. For Generation 2, there is fire, water, ice, earth, stone, and jungle this time, not air, alongside light and shadow. Now, fire, ice, earth, light, and shadow function basically the same in Generation 1 of Bionicle that they do to Generation 2 of Bionicle. But the other 3 elements are a little bit different. Jungle is sort of a combination of plant life and air. Water is a sort of combination of water and lightning. And stone is a combination of stone and sand. They kind of mixed 3 of the primary elements and 3 of the secondary elements together to create the new Generation 2 elements. And what makes that even more interesting is that Generation 2 did this weird price tier thing with the Toa, where some of the Toa were $15 and some of the Toa were $20. But all the Toa that remained the same with their element, more or less, stayed at a $20 price tag, or were the ones that got the expensive $20 price tag, whereas the ones that got the buffs to their power and their more complicated abilities were the ones that wound up with the $15 price tag. And so that's just one of those weird, interesting things about Bionicle that just I don't know if the developers intended that to be giving the lower tiers a buff, but they did. I actually have not been paying attention to this chasm much since we entered it. Where exactly are we in it so far? Oh, we're already making good progress. Actually, no, not really. You see the Gliok Din over there. That's what a big rock wall is. There's a Flux Construct coming out. Oh, we definitely missed that guy then. Because I did not fight any flux constructs until we started, because I didn't spot any until I had already explored the Elden region, and so I definitely missed that guy. So that's definitely a boss fight that we haven't done. Okay, so I guess while we're on the topic of Bionicle and elements, the other thing that I could talk about, theoretically, would be the difference between earth and stone. Because one of the big things you see people say about Bionicle when they first start learning about it is that it's kind of dumb that earth and stone are separate elements. And that's actually something that a lot of the fandom agrees on. Like, nobody's really 100% sure why they did that, why they decided to make those two completely separate things. But in the actual story, earth and stone do play out as decently different things. And I think the primary difference between them is that earth controls dirt, soil, and mud, while stone controls rocks and boulders. Is the primary difference between the two. I mean, the best sort of shorthand descriptor I could give for it is that imagine you're playing Minecraft. If you have to dig something with a shovel in Minecraft, that's a Toa of Earth's territory. If you have to dig something with a pickaxe, that's what a Toa of Stone does. And it's very similar logic to how Pokemon has rock Pokemon and ground Pokemon. It's like Diglett's a mole. I don't really know my Pokemon elements. Maybe I'm fucking this up, but Diglett's a mole. Moles live in the ground, so it makes sense for Diglett to be a ground type. Moles aren't made of rocks, and Diglett isn't made of rock, and so of course Diglett isn't a rock type. They're very, very similar concepts, but not entirely identical. And the reasons why they are separate in Bionicle. Ooh, there's the Yiga camp I missed too. Neat. And the reasons why, or did we miss that one? Did the guy just respawn? Yeah, we've done that one. And this is actually where I spotted DINRAAL before. I think in that one stream where the footage cut. That's the one I raided and then went to DINRAAL because he was passing above overhead. The important thing to keep in mind about Bionicle, the elements in Bionicle, is the elements truly are kind of secondary in the grand scheme of things. The Matoran were originally built to be a worker sort of class sort of things, and their elements are more reflective of the environments that lived in. Like I mentioned before, fire Matoran work in hot areas, so they're heat resistance. For population numbers, we know that there's a bare minimum of 100,000 Matoran in the Matoran universe, but at their peak power, there were only 1,000 Toa. That's the maximum. There are barely any Toa with elemental powers compared to the Matoran, who don't have elemental powers and are just kind of along for the ride. And so there's a lot of redundancy in Toa powers because those are kind of secondary. Their magic abilities are kind of secondary compared to the more general culture that the races possess. I think a good example would be when I was listing up the secondary elements, iron, magnetism, and gravity are all separate elements in Bionicle. But when you turn iron and magnetism into magic powers, they work basically the same. When you turn magnetism and gravity into magic powers, they basically work the same. But when you turn iron and gravity into magic powers, they're not very similar at all. They're actually quite a bit different. And that kind of holds true for Earth and Stone, where they're very similar, but there certainly is a difference. And it's a difference that's kind of reflected in other elements. There's the fire temple, which is very cool. I wonder if actually can ascend out of the fire temple. I never really noticed how low down the ceiling was. I bet you probably could. Death Cauldron up there. There's that Colosseum, where I think it was that one Moblins? I think it was that Colosseum, or by the other Leviathan now. The elemental powers that the Toa have are a bit secondary compared to the culture of the Matoran that follow them. So it'd be worth talking about the culture of Matoran of Earth and Matoran of Stone and figuring out what's the same and different about them. I think the first one to address would be the color palette, because this is the other area where things get a little bit similar. For Matoran of Earth, their main color is black, and their secondary colors are usually purple, orange, or dark gray. For Matoran of Stone, their primary color is brown, and their secondary color is usually tan or bronze. Now, that said, there are more colors that can appear in either race. Matoran of Earth are also known to sometimes have tan coloration, and Toa of Stone are known to sometimes have yellow, orange, black, and technically red coloration, although that's not really canon, the red coloration. Um, and so Matoran of Earth and Stone actually have sort of other like overlapping color palettes. Um, but the thing to keep in mind is that that's not the only like instance where that happens. Toa of Fire can also have yellow, orange, and red in a color scheme, just like Toa of Stone. And yet, most of the time, you can tell a Matoran of Fire from a Toa of Stone. And the same applies for Earth and Stone. While they have similar types of colors that they can be, the actual distribution of those colors tends to be quite a bit different. The only exception is black mask, tan body, black feet. That color combo appears on a lot of Matoran of Stone and a lot of Matoran of Earth, and it can make them very easy to be mixed up. And I have no idea how like intentional that really was on the part of the like writers. I imagine that they did not mean to like make those elements so similar accidentally from a color palette, but like that is like the one exception to their color palettes being distinct. But when it comes to like the Toa of Earth and Stone and the Turaga of Earth and Stone, even though there's not many of them, you can like always tell them apart, and 99% of the time you can tell them apart. And so color-wise, they are pretty distinct and special. Then environmentally is where you get into the next sort of major difference between the two. Matoran of Earth tend to live underground. They like to live in tunnels and dark places far beneath the surface. Whereas Matoran of Stone, they tend to live in arid biomes. They usually live in deserts and rocky canyons on the edges of deserts. So they live in quite like different environments, and the natural traits of these Matoran races kind of reflect those environments that they live in. Matoran of Earth have incredibly poor eyesight compared to most other Matoran, but great night vision. They can't see well during the day, but they can see well during the dark or at night. And we don't really know if this applies to the Matoran themselves, but the Toa and Turaga would imply this. Matoran of Earth seem to have more hunched backs to make them small and able to fit into like tight spaces, and they have big clawed hands to assist in digging up the environment. Then when you get to the Matoran of Stone, their main sort of like defining characteristics is they have a very hardy and resilient like build. They are not easy to knock down. They're not quite as heat resistant necessarily as a Toa of Fire is, but they are pretty resilient to like the desert sun, and they can go for long distances without wearing out. They also, according to the Toa and Turaga, seem to have pretty long legs and to move rather quickly across those desert sands. Job-wise, their environments and their sort of traits sort of influence the jobs that they have, at least to some degree. For Matoran of Earth, most of them are miners and engineers, alongside a lot of historians and scholars. Whereas for Matoran of Stone, they are mostly artists and sculptors. They're mostly sculptors. And it can be sculptures for the sake of art, like creating statues and busts. It could be sculpting for the sake of masonry, of building buildings and bricks. And they even sculpt tools. If you need stone tools, you usually buy those stone tools from Matoran of Stone. Now, personality-wise, there is also a bit of a difference between Matoran of Earth and Matoran of Stone. It is worth noting that Matoran were not supposed to have personalities. They were supposed to be worker drones when they were originally created by the Great Beings. But for reasons that I won't spoil, they all ended up developing personalities and cultures, the Matoran. And so it is worth addressing what those personalities and cultures ended up being. So Matoran of Earth, their like big sort of defining characteristic is that they're wise and patient. They tend to stay quiet and observe what is going on around them, and only really like intervene when it's absolutely necessary. They're kind of observationists, but they're very, very intelligent, very smart, and they will give words of wisdom to just about anybody who asks for it. That also makes them great strategists. Anua was the team strategist for the Toa Manta, but Toa Stone can also be great strategists, so that doesn't super mean much. While this only really applies to the island of Metru Nui, it's also worth noting that there's a bit of a fatalist mindset when it comes to the Matoran of Earth. During Metru Nui, there was this big thing about the Matoran of Earth being obsessed with the past and Matoran of Ice being obsessed with the future, even though realistically you kind of needed both to really plan things out. And the fan base kind of like did some digging into the way that the people act, and they think they figured out why exactly it is the Matoran of Earth sort of ignore the future so much. And the long and the short of it is that from the perspective of Matoran of Earth, they don't really have a future. The archives are a very dangerous place. They're full of all sorts of deadly monsters and even artifacts, basically the SCP foundation of the Bionicle universe, that it's very easy to die in the archives. Matoran of Earth don't super care about what's going to happen to them in the future because they have no guarantee that they have a future. They could just die tomorrow and no one would know or care. And so they are more concerned with the prospect of leaving a legacy, of doing something that people will remember them for when they inevitably die. And that's also why they love looking to the past so much, because they want to pay some level of respect to the people that came before them. This also creates a little bit of an independent attitude among Earth Elementals, at least in Metru Nui. You don't really see this in Mat Nui, but in Metru Nui, they were very much unwilling to accept help from others, which is something that shifts to a stone personality trait during the Mat Nui arc. But you can kind of see it in the stone elementals in Metru Nui too. So yeah, that's how the Matoran of Earth budget behave. So Matoran and Stone and their behavior, it's not quite as easy to pinpoint down as Matoran of Earth, but if I had to describe it as anything, it would be resilient. Not resilient. If I didn't describe it as anything, it would be stubborn. And I mean that not just in the negative connotation, but also in a bit of a positive connotation. The thing with Toe of Stone is that they can be very hard to convince to a course of action. Or Matoran of Stone too. They can be very hard to convince to a course of action, to like get going in a certain direction that you want them to follow. They tend to choose their own path. And once they have chosen their own path, there is nothing that will get them off of that path. And this can be take the forms of two real extreme ends of the spectrum. There's the friendly Toe of Stone, and there's the asshole Toe of Stone. Where essentially, some Toe of Stone, like Pahatu and most of the Matoran that we met on Mat Nui, are overly friendly. They're very joyous and boisterous, and they tend to try and be your friend. But they do that to an excessive and unhealthy degree. They are incapable of taking a hint, of realizing when it is that their friendship isn't needed or wanted, and when the person needs space. They just kind of thrust themselves into a situation and assume that they are wanted no matter what. Which conversely can push people away when they're feeling suffocated by the attention. The opposite end of the spectrum is what we see with Anua and most of the Matoran and Metru Nui, and that's the asshole aspect of Toe of Stone, where if a Toa does not like you, they will let you know. They will verbally abuse you to no end, and will laugh at your misfortune. They tend to just stay in their own little world, their own little head, and they assume that their way of doing things is the best way of doing things ever. Which, when you're the friendly, that does translate into at least you're being nice to me. But when you're the asshole one, that translates to, wow, you were tearing this team apart. You were like the worst fucking addition to this team ever. So yeah, they can be very stubborn and difficult to change their opinions. There was nothing I wanted to say about the personality of Toe Stone that I've now blanked on. What was I going to say? I can't remember now. Oh, the other thing that they do is that the Toe of Stone are rather jokesters. I wouldn't necessarily call them jovial. I think the Toe of Air is more of the jovial element. But stone elementals tend to use humor to diffuse tension in a situation. And again, based on the actual personality of the Toa of Stone, the way that they go about this diffusal can vary. For Pahatu, his humor was very friendly and wholesome. He was joking about the situation that they were in and trying to create a sense of bonding and kinship with the other Toa through like, get a load of this. Oh, what do we gotta put up with today? Very like not taking the situation that seriously. For Anawa though, his way of joking was being very like aggressively truthful about any situation that he was in. If he If he was seeing you're doing something wrong, he would voice that and laugh at you for doing it wrong. If a situation seemed dire or bleak, he would joke about how we were all going to die, but he'd also point the blame on everything but himself. And so, a little bit like different methods of joke. Oh, cool, we're passing by that big ass lake that I was stuck in for forever. So, very different methods of cracking jokes, but still ultimately cracking jokes to diffuse the tension of a situation is what they like to do. Now, where things get like extra interesting, I think we can get I think by the time he reaches this, he should be ready to drop a claw, and so we'll get a claw off of her there, and then we'll call it a DINRAAL, and we'll probably also call the stream because that should be about perfectly an hour. Which, if there are going to be an hour, I'm going to split them up into separate streams anyway. And so I think we'll do DINRAAL today, and I think we'll do like Nitro or Feroce next time we do this. Oh yeah. But things get even more interesting when you start throwing in the Spherus Magna versions of these elements. We don't have nearly as much information or details on the Spherus Magna culture as we do the Matoran Universe culture. The world building for 2009 was just kind of shit, generally. There's an ascension point up there. And not like super, super well developed. But for the one tribe that we do have like a decent bit of knowledge about is the Rock tribe, consisting of the Skrull species. There were a few Agori that lived with them, but there wasn't a lot of Agori. It was mostly the Skrull species. And Skrull actually live in a bit of a caste-based society, where there's 3 different like sort of types of Skrull. I think it's a soldier, warrior, and leader class. And each class is given a sort of updated status. Leaders are in charge of everything. They're super big and strong, and they are given a name as a birthright in order to lead the people. For the warriors and soldiers, they aren't given names unless if they prove themselves in battle or combat or do something incredibly important for the tribe. The Skrull, we don't have really like any like knowledge of proper like jobs or like businesses that they would run, how they like manage their economy or get resources or anything. But we do know that they were a very militaristic race. They loved combat, they loved battle, and they were super aggressive to anything that dared approach them. They were essentially like, you can say this about a lot of things in Bionicle, but they were sort of like the orcs of the Bionicle world. And this sort of like mentality of getting rid of individualism among them, just treating themselves as one collective group of Skrull. Only the best and the best of fighters were given the privilege of being recognized as a unique person. They kind of dehumanize themselves in a way. The Vorok's probably the one that we know the next most about, but it's still not a lot. The Vorok's, prior to the Shattering, which I'm not going to say what that was, but Bionicle fans will know what that is. Prior to the Shattering, the Vorok's were a tribe of desert nomads who wouldn't really stay in one place for too long. They just kind of roamed the dunes alongside the Zesk, which were sort of their version of Bori. They would roam the dunes from place to place, going wherever the wind took them. However, after the Shattering, for reasons that are not super well explained, and also I won't go into, they ended up digressing and de-evolving into a sort of savage race. They lost a lot of their higher brain functioning and a lot of their communication skills, to the point where a lot of people just treated them like wild animals, these big scorpion men who lived in the desert. That said, there is still some semblance of a culture in the Sam tribe, and the Vorok's and the Zesk, even in their more savage, quote-unquote, state. And I'd say like the biggest like defining personality characteristic among them is that they are very much for no man gets left behind. If you hurt a single Vorok's, every other Vorok's is going to attack you. A slight against one of them is a slight against all of them. But at the same time, they are smart about battle. If too many Vorok's die in a specific, like a particular assault or event, they will realize that the situation is unwinnable, and in order to preserve themselves, everybody who's remaining, the entire tribe will flee. They're very much about like squashing out threats the second that they emerge, and if they can't squash it out, get away from it. They also appear to be, rather than one connected sand tribe, especially after their digression, they appear to be more of a collection of different tribes, just kind of traveling throughout the sands of the desert. I like this sort of pillar tree thing over here, by the way. That's cool. Um, I haven't been super paying attention to the environment, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing this live on camera and actually talking. But whatever. But yeah, they just kind of roam the desert and do whatever. So then that brings us to the Earth Tribe, and they probably have the least development in Bionicle because they are more or less cut content. They were going to be in the fifth Bionicle movie and in the 2010 story arc, but then Bionicle was canceled, and the movie was canned. The sets for them were cut. But despite that, the main writer of the books, Greg Farshty, insists that there still are a canon race in the Bionicle world, and he thinks they are still at least somewhat relevant to the franchise's plot. What exactly is the deal with the Earth Tribe? Well, the best way I think I could describe them. Well, I guess we'll start with their jobs and positions and their environment. I didn't really get into the environment of the Rock Tribe of the Skrull. The Skrull are mainly live in mountain ranges. The Vorax mainly live in deserts, like I mentioned. The Earth Tribe largely lived in large open plains and fields. And their main sort of deal is that they were an agricultural society. They would grow most of the crops and food for the rest of Spherus Magna. However, the main sort of defining trait for the Earth Tribe is that they were very much opportunistic, and almost conniving sort of sorts. The only one we have any proper personality, like canon personality for, is the Elemental Lord of Earth. And her deal, again, without getting too much into spoilers, now that I said her deal, I realized like this is going to be hard to talk about without spoilers. But essentially, there was a war going on, and she like subtly changed things to prompt the other tribes to go to war, and then she willingly abstained her tribe from the war, with her ultimate plan being for the other tribes to wipe each other out, and then once they were weak and battered, and they'd already harvested this precious resource they were after, her tribe could sneak in and steal it out from under them and rule the planet. And we still see a little bit of this conniving sort of angle through through the cut movie, through the unreleased fifth Bionicle movie. Originally, they were going to be, and I don't really like this plot point. I'm sure people will understand why when I explain it. But in the fifth Bionicle movie, it was originally going to be a thing where Matt Nui and his crew were going to team up with two Glatorian of Earth. And the other Glatorian were going to be very distrustful of these Glatorian of Earth because there is a stereotype in their universe of Agorian Glatorian of Earth being very untrustworthy, conniving, and scheming individuals who cannot be trusted. And then the entire movie was going to go by of them being with the team, and then at the very end of the film, those two Glatorian of Earth were going to betray everyone and try and take the treasure for themselves, filling out the stereotype. Which, cool, Blood Moon. Which, not a super fan of that angle. That's like, it is fantasy. It is like fantasy cyborg race, and so it's not literally, but it does kind of, it does sound a little bit racist, that, oh wow, the species associated with being evil are all evil? Oh no. Which you can say that about the Skrull and the Vorax too, but at least like it wasn't like outright confirmed that they were like these two individuals specifically live up to the stereotype, a bit of a bummer. And then by the sounds of things though, that stereotype was going to end up playing true further in like the future of the franchise. Because Greg has talked about what his plans were for the epilogue that never got finished. And originally, the Earth Tribe were going to show up, and they were going to try and do the same thing of like conniving to get people to turn against each other, and then stealing and then taking over the planet. No, that's not quite what it was. I'm trying to remember exactly how he worded it. I think it was the Earth Tribe was afraid that the other tribes would try and go for them for starting the core war, since that was common knowledge now. And so they were building up their defenses for when the other tribes inevitably attacked them. Even though, as far as we know, no attack was actually being planned by the other tribes. That was all just in the Earth Tribe's head of assuming that the world was going to behave like they did. We'll let this Blood Moon pop, and then I think that's probably a good place to stop. I talked about basically everything I wanted to in that sort of rant in like the perfect amount of time to complete DINRAAL's path. So that's kind of nice. Alright, well, let's check out, I always forget that it shrinks. I think I've pointed out, like, oh wow, it shrinks before. So yeah, there's DINRAAL's path, which kind of loops back on itself. It was very interesting. It's different than, like, the other ones to actually circle. And actually, I realize now, using the hero's journey to track them is actually not going to be, like, that effective. Both because, like, now I know where the paths are, but also I have so much other hero's journey markings on this map that, like, that's just all going to blend in. Oops. And actually, it looks like we've built up a little bit over the third of the hero's journey, so we've been playing for just over 100 hours, I think. Which I think I can finish everything else in this game in 200 hours, right? It'd be weird if I didn't. We're already 60 streams in. I doubt this will go past 120. But yeah, I think I'm going to call it there, both because it's about time that I eat. Originally, I wanted to do all 3 of these in one stream, but if it's going to take an hour for each and not 30 minutes, I don't really think that's going to be worth it. It's going to be a while before we do the next Riding a Dragon stream, but don't worry, one will come. We're going to call it there for now. Thanks for tuning in, and bye-bye.